The first three classes of the semester will be focused on the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. This is how important we consider the Hebrew Bible for the Christian theological tradition. So in the next few segments, I'm going to take you through the Hebrew Bible and help you to understand something of it by way of an introduction. First of all, the name. What do we call it? The traditional Christian rendering of this body of literature has been the Old Testament. I'm rather uncomfortable using that term freely, or at least exclusively, because it is not the Old Testament to a large group of people who regard this as their scripture. Of course, I mean the Jews. And the Jews regard this as their holy scriptures. So for Christians to say the Old Testament, we are in some sense implying that it has been supplanted or replaced or improved by the addition of the New Testament. Now that is the understanding of the Christian tradition somewhat. We'll talk about that in class, but it fails to acknowledge that this literature has belonged to another people for thousands of years. The term that I prefer is the Hebrew Bible. Now that's not a perfect term either, because the entirety of the Hebrew Bible is not in fact written in Hebrew. So we're going to use that term interchangeably with Old Testament, with the understanding of the limitations of both. Next point I want to make has to do with the languages of the Hebrew Bible. And of course, the first language that we're going to deal with is Hebrew. Hebrew is a language which was spoken in that region of the world. The language itself, Hebrew, died as a common language over 2,000 years ago, and in an absolutely unique occurrence was revived in the 1920s and 30s by Zionists settling in the British Protectorate of Palestine. And it's, as far as I know, the only case in the history of the world where a language has died and then been brought back into common usage. Hebrew is very closely related and very similar to the modern spoken language of Arabic as well. They're part of the same language family. Most of the Hebrew Bible is written in the Hebrew language. It was the language that was spoken in that region of the world that we now know of as Israel or Palestine. There is another very closely related language that some of the Bible is written in, and that is Aramaic. Whereas Hebrew was the language spoken in that particular region of the world, there'll be geography a little bit later, Aramaic was the language spoken in ancient Babylon during the 6th and 5th centuries, what we know of as modern-day Iraq. And a very small portion of the Hebrew Bible is written in Aramaic. It looks exactly like Hebrew. The grammatical structure and much of the vocabulary is very similar. It would be probably closer to Hebrew than, say, French is to Spanish. Parts of the book of Daniel, parts of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are written in Aramaic, and the entirety of the Old Testament is translated into an Aramaic version, but that does not concern us. The third language that the Bible was written in, the Old Testament was written in, is Greek. And this is where we engage in a bit of controversy. Now, the entirety of the New Testament is written in Greek. And it's a kind of Greek that was imposed on the entire Eastern and Central Mediterranean world by Alexander the Great, who was, big surprise, a Greek. And the Jews, during the period of Alexander's conquest, were taught to speak Greek, and that was the language of commerce, and that was the language of diplomacy. And if you wanted to get anywhere in what was called Hellenistic or Greek society, you had to learn Greek. And not only was the entirety of the Old Testament translated into Greek, a version, a very important version that we call the Septuagint, Septuagint, Septuigint, was the Bible of the first century church. This is the Bible that they used. This is the Bible that they quote in the New Testament. That's why it's important. But additionally to the translation of the Hebrew and the Aramaic portions of the Bible into Greek that we find in the Septuagint, there are also a number of other Jewish books that were either written in Greek, and that's the case for most of them, or they were translated from Aramaic or Hebrew into Greek, and we've lost the originals. These Greek books of the Bible, which were not in the Hebrew texts, but were in the Greek translations, they're Jewish books, and they are called, well, they have a few different names. They are called by Roman Catholics and Orthodox the Deuterocanon. Now, deutero means second, and canon means the officially recognized list of books. So this is the second list of officially recognized books. The Protestants have called this collection of books, and I think the Jews too, the Apocrypha. Apocrypha means the secret or the hidden writings. I don't know why that name arose, because they've never been secret and they've never been hidden. But the Jews in the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era decided to no longer recognize the Greek books as officially sanctioned scripture, but only the Hebrew ones. And the Protestants in the 15th and 16th century decided to follow the Jewish pattern of book acceptance and to reject these books as scripture. So we have a case where the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox accept these Greek books as scripture, whereas the Jewish community and the Protestants do not. Although these books are quoted in the New Testament, they were part of the first century church's scripture and have been deeply influential throughout the history of the Christian tradition, even among the Jews and the Protestants. And we'll talk about that as we get to it.